I came on this honestly as a teenage lefty reading about World War One, and I came to despise Woodrow Wilson, and also, and this probably is part what drove me towards libertarianism, I came to despise the progressive era. I came to see it as just a great exercise in social control.
Hi there, welcome back to the Non-Serviam podcast. It's always a bonus when Jesse Walker is here in the internet studio. Welcome, Jesse Walker. Hello.
I'm glad to be here in the internet studio.
I need to find a better way of describing that, but that's accurate. Jesse Walker is still, as far as I know, the book's editor of Reason, where he has written on topics ranging from pirate radio to conspiracy theories and from cults to copyright law. He's the author of Rebels on the Air and United States of Paranoia. And as a segue, even though it's awkward to read praise, I feel like I should also note that in your Reason bio, it says the Los Angeles Times has described him as a writer willing to attack the sacred cows of the right and left with equal amounts of intelligence and flair, which seems fair.
Notice they didn't say how much. It could be like an equal amount, but a very, very small amount. So,
Well, that's better than a lot of people are doing, perhaps, possibly. You were either episode number 1 with me as host or 2, maybe Corey was episode 0, but listeners, just listen to this one and it's going to be better than even the last one, so like don't even worry about it. But so many things have happened since you were last on, in whatever year that was.
2022.
Okay, that's what I thought. We have some things to talk about, including some cool articles that you've written lately that we will link to. But I actually want to do a foundational Jesse Walker bio part at the beginning. And I feel like in our entire friendship, I don't know that I've ever asked you directly, how would you describe your politics right now? Like if I accosted you in an elevator about
I'm a moderate, basically.
it. That is not true.
um, I was telling someone that I'm not a moderate, but sometimes I feel like a mediator because I have all these, contacts on the left and the right, and I can make sense of people to other people and stand between them. But I don't know. How would you? I mean, I'm a libertarian with a small L. I'm a classical radical. I think that's better than being a classical liberal. I don't think that phrase has been colonized by annoying people yet because I'm the only one who uses it.
That's true. Yeah.
I'm sort of in the Discordian tradition of libertarianism, if that means anything to people. I'm influenced by folks ranging from James Scott to Gene Sharp to Robert Anton Wilson, Thomas Zaz, the younger Murray Rothbard. I,
Yeah.
you got to use that modifier, but I did read a
Mm-hmm.
bunch of them at some point. Um, you know, your whole kind of reads both Hayek and Foucault and the Weekly World News kind of guy.
Yeah, that seems like a good summary of you in that last bit, actually.
You can cut the rest, then.
That's all.
Yeah.
Have you changed? Like I've talked about your journey with you, but have you feel like you've made any radical changes or even moderate changes in your political ideology?
Sure. I mean, I wasn't born this way.
Are you sure?
Yeah. Despite the song,
Mm-hmm.
I but yeah, it's sort of an ongoing evolution. I don't know if the listeners would be all that interested in hearing me chastise my 20 something self for various things that I was not that I'm not as into anymore or didn't recognize or whatever. But I've certainly changed my mind on a number of issues. Do you mean kind of like foundational ideological stuff, or just kind of more short term what I think of the world as I look at it and try to make sense of politics kind of
I
thing.
mean, I guess both those, which, only encompasses most of your life, so.
Yeah, right. Well, I'll tell you one of the latter is when the party sorting we were watching now, and of course I'm neither a Democrat nor a Republican, but I used to see the kind of the ideological sharpening of the two parties as being a good thing, that it meant they stood for something more than they did before. And I've completely kind of flipped on that. I look back now on the days when you had not just liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats, but all kinds of liberal Republicans, all kinds of conservative Democrats, and see the sort of spaces for cooperation that were kind of opened up, like so that even though when you're stuck in a two-party system, the more kind of finely honed the two parties are, the less space there is for people who don't fit the basic party line, whatever it is that week of those two parties, and I miss the days when you could have a Republican like Mark Hatfield, or a Democrat like Fred Harris, just sort of mixing things up a bit, and I think a lot of some of the to the extent that good things emerged from Congress, they often emerged from the kind of transpartisan cooperation that I think that setup allowed for more of, if that. And I'm feeling that more now because the project I'm working on right now, which I probably shouldn't talk a ton about just because I'm still doing the reporting and formulating it, but it involves like looking back at a lot of left right stuff, in the 60s and 70s, and just sort of seeing a totally different landscape that allowed a lot of that stuff to happen, although of course, the most interesting stuff even then was happening outside the parties, so maybe it's
Mhm.
not as directly relevant. But yeah. So I don't know. Does that answer your question? I guess I could
I
answer
don't
it all.
know. It answered something.
Yeah.
Well, actually, that sort of answered the what you're working on of late thing. But it feels like a decent time to start asking you about um, some of your recent articles. I see here I wrote down the quote about that you were quoting Jay Kinney, who I don't actually know who that is, who said in 1988, the one place where the far left and the far right have been likely to meet is at the vitamin counter.
Yeah.
And I didn't know that anyone would have said that in 1988.
Yeah. It actually there's this whole kind of health food element to like the Birchers. Like they got really into the laetrile thing and like sort of health food and vitamins and defying the FDA at the same time that hippies were into that. So
Yeah, I guess I must have. That makes
and Jay
sense.
Kinney, who he was I've gotten him to write for Reason a few times. He was an underground cartoonist.
Okay.
He wrote for the Whole Earth catalog and became the editor of its spin-off magazine, the Whole Earth Review, for a while. And he started on the left and then sort of went through a very windy journey. And I don't know how he would. I don't think he. If you asked him that first question you asked me, he would give you an even more labyrinthine answer than I did
Hmm.
because he's but at any rate, he was the sort of person who would observe that kind of thing. That there was a meeting of the horseshoe. I hate the horseshoe metaphor, but I'm going to use it anyway. A meeting of the horseshoe at the health food shop and the vitamin counter. Yeah, and of course that's intensified recently. I think COVID really brought out that side of the right to a much greater extent than it had been there before, and now all sorts of people are into alternative medicine, and even before then you had certain sort of paleos who are into the paleo diet, right?
Of course.
Or who are into, like, I don't even understand what the seed oil thing is supposed to be because I don't find these issues all that interesting except sociologically, so I don't really know what the health effects are or aren't that they're claiming. But it was sort of building for a while, I think there was in the time shortly before COVID, there was still more of this than there was when Jay Kinney wrote that in the 80s.
Hmm.
But COVID really put it on steroids. And of course, it happened at the same time that you see people on the right getting involved with New Age spirituality, in some cases, even with psychedelics. I mean, there's a whole reshuffling, cultural reshuffling happening that a lot of people still can't quite get their minds around.
I definitely can't yet. I've even seen as a follower of what on Reddit they call fundy snark, which is sort of about fundamentalist Christian influencers and how they try to, you know, do their social media stuff. I've noticed that a lot more definitely uh, solidly Christian and right wing people will be more obviously New Age as well. You know, they even do yoga and don't think the devil is in it. But like, as
Yeah,
someone who came out of homeschooling, like that seems a little new to me, if I'm not
yeah, and of course, some of them still do see the devil in it, and there's,
wrong.
mutual firing upon one another. There is this kind of so much of the American tradition. There's like the New Thought tradition in America, which kind of dates back to 19th century. There's a lot of the kind of think yourself rich, you think your way to better health and wealth kind of thinking
Hmm.
in America comes from there, and it has a Christian form, and it also has this more kind of spiraled out New Age, non-denominational, weird form, and it manifests itself in different ways. In the not this past election cycle, but the previous one, I profiled Marianne Williamson, and of course she comes from that tradition,
That's right.
and
Yeah.
as I noted in the article, so does Donald Trump, whose childhood pastor was Norman Vincent Peale. The man does not seem a very religious person, but he really does seem to have imbibed the whole kind of if you believe it hard enough, it can become true style of American thinking. So there's been this kind of interpenetration for a while, and as I mean, there's the genuine fundamentalists have come out of their enclaves, because it used to be you sort of thought of fundamentalists as keeping to themselves. They were not worldly. They did not
Hmm.
go to the movies, let alone watch TV, and so on. And it was really, I think, a lot of what really propelled them out of that was the televangelists. You had Pat Robertson and Jerry Falwell and all on television, and you could tune in and watch the 700 Club, which was a religious show, but was also modeled on the Tonight Show in many ways, and had the Christian world version of celebrity guests, and this sort of gradually easing of people into the American mainstream. And as that happens, I think there's more cross pollination between the kind of the evangelical world. I'll say that's broader than fundamentalist.
Hmm.
And fundamentalist is a little bit of a, you know, pejorative term, which I don't want to get into in this context. But the evangelical world and the New Age world, and now, of course, people just use evangelical as an identity. So you have these surveys where people who identify as evangelicals but aren't even going to church once a week. Um, and a lot of them are Trump supporters. So there's a lot is very much in movement in ways that are fascinating to watch and difficult to label. I mean, it's not even clear when you look at surveys now where you're asking evangelicals or some of the other labels people could adopt for themselves things, if you're really even talking about the same group that would have been using that label 40 years ago.
Hmm.
So, boy, that was a long-winded way of answering your question. But yeah, I do think there's a whole lot more mixing in that kind of, but it's also part of the long-standing American religious melting pot. I mean, centuries ago, you could have someone who goes to church, but also see someone on the side who's a fortune teller. I mean,
Hmm.
there's always been that in America. It's just now we do it on this national or even global and increasingly electronically mediated scale.
Do you find that I read the book, was it Jesus and John Wayne, I think last year, and I think the foundational argument in that is basically that as soon as evangelicals chose Reagan and decided that someone like Jimmy Carter, who is kind of an evangelical, just a Democrat one, that is when they became sort of the world because they decided to embrace the Hollywood man who was divorced and stuff.
Well, not just that, but Reagan was in many ways, part of that New Thought tradition as well, or at least sort of an Emersonian spiritual tradition that was not, the the tradition of a lot of his allies on the
Hmm.
Christian right. Yeah, I mean, Pat Robertson basically endorsed Jimmy Carter in 1976.
Right. Yeah, I was very surprised when I saw
He
that.
kind of hedges, kind of retroactively hedges it, but he basically endorsed him. And then, of course, did not in 1980. And there is but it's not just a matter of whether you're going to back Reagan instead of Carter. And Carter did like sort of accept a lot of these folks' support and then not give them nearly as much as if they wanted in return. I mean, he was, and of course, other parts of his coalition were antithetical to them. But it was just a
Hmm.
matter of getting involved in politics in the first place. A lot of these groups were not known for voting, or a lot of members of these groups were not known for voting. And there is a Jerry Falwell sermon in, I think, the 60s. I mean, it was the 60s. I can't think of what year it was, where he's like sort of warning people against political activism. Now, the context is people getting involved with civil rights activism. So there's a
Right.
little bit of a different tenor to it. But it's still, and you can sort of see what might change that something else becomes more important. But it's not just that, because you also start to see something happening there, or actually see it on a large scale, because it had been very gradually building for a while before the 70s. But the cooperation of socially conservative Catholics and Protestants, and even more controversially, Mormons, really starts to take off with these groups like the Moral Majority,
Hmm.
and like leaders like, especially someone like Phyllis Schlafly, who was not a denominational leader herself. Not, although, I mean, Pat Robertson was multi-denominational too, so I might be drawing too sharp a boundary here. But I mean, at any rate, there's this, and what initially becomes this sort of tentative alliance nowadays. I mean, the division between conservative Protestants, and I think a conservative Protestant feels much more separated typically from a liberal Protestant than from a conservative Catholic. Certainly among politically active folks, I get that impression. And there is a general sense that a lot of what used to be the big culture war boundaries, conflicts in America are not that important anymore, in part because people formed these alliances to fight the culture wars of the 70s, stuff
Hmm.
about gay rights, abortion, and so on. And you can still that still continues to reshuffle. I think the extent to which gay groups or gay people are being accepted in a lot of the right wing fold, though not all of it now, is interesting to watch, especially if they're gays who are critical of the trans movement.
Oh yeah.
So this reshuffling happens constantly, but that was a really those things all. I mean, so the thing that you mentioned, the willingness to back Reagan instead of Carter, the larger willingness to get involved with politics at all, and the
Hmm.
willingness to overlook what used to be really vivid and contentious denominational barriers were all big shifts there. And that's when you really start to see more and more, hear more and more rather, the phrase Judeo-Christian to bring in sort of conservative Jews.
Yeah.
And right at the end of this century, there was this sort of tentative move, folks like Grover Norquist, to bring in socially conservative Muslims. And
Ooh.
9/11 kind of slammed the door shut on that for a couple decades. But now maybe opening up again, and we might start hearing Abrahamic instead of Judeo-Christian. So it's I probably left your question far behind with that answer, but
That's okay. That's how we travel sometimes. Yeah, that makes more sense for them to do. And it's one of those things where, as if they heard me, I'm going to curse ever thinking, why doesn't that happen? Because it's going to lead to social conservatism, which is not what we should have. But why not work with all religions to be?
if the social conservative alliances of today are what it takes to undermine the social conservative critiques of yesteryear, maybe that is how progress happens.
I don't know. I'd have
I
to
mean, I mean,
check.
really, I mean, you do not hear about, well, you do. You do not have the kind of discrimination against Catholics in this country that you did a century ago. You know,
Yeah.
I mean, I think that is a step forward. And you have had a mass acceptance. across the country of gay people. I
Mhm.
mean, it's kind of it's depressing the extent to which it becomes, well, you need to find a new enemy to accept the old one. But I do think that if you see it as two steps forward, one step back, or one step back, that's better than one step forward, two steps back, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know. Anyway, you can't be for it or against it. It's just a historical irony that you can't help
Mhm.
observing. So
I will ask you more about how literally how things have changed since we last talked, maybe in a little bit. But let me realign, not unlike the political spectrum, my questioning, see if you will talk about kind of specifically your longer piece. Is it literally headlined How Crises
it's called How the Political Spectrum Turned Inside Out. There's like a separate SEO headline that you might see
I
wandering
just
around.
unhelpfully paraphrased it. Okay, so
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Which they, yeah, because they wanted to get like the word COVID in there to get extra searches, But it's, but yes, how the political spectrum turned inside out.
well, how did it? And you have three different major crises over the past.
I basically look at the last 20 years, or if you prefer, last, like, I mean, since the beginning of the century. So
Mhm,
you could, because I kind of do talk about 9/11, but and the political spectrum is always evolving as different issues grow or shrink in salience. And so this is not something that's only happened in the last, over the course of this century, but I focused then on what happened. And of course, there's a lot of angles you could take on this, but I focused in particular on what you might call the anti-establishment sector. The A group of political scientists actually identified something they called an anti-establishment orientation, where people distrust the established political order, irrespective of partisanship and ideology. I used it in a sort of a broader sense than they do, because they are talking about a very specifically Manichaean and conspiratorial sort of populism. And I'm like, you know what? You can believe that there are good but mistaken folks in the establishment. You can be cynical about ordinary people too, and you'll still be part of this sector. I mean, as defined broadly, I am in this sector. I don't know that I would
mhm,
fit the original, more narrow definition that those political scientists used. But within this sector, I mean, if you saw someone flip from Ron Paul to Bernie Sanders to Donald Trump to RFK Jr., that is a journey that you and I probably know several people who have done, and yet sounds absolutely mysterious to people in the more conventional left or
yeah,
right. And so I looked in particular over the last quarter century of how this group evolved, because you could look at all sorts of, I mean, you could look at how the neocons evolved, or actually sort of split into two, because there's like the Trumpy ones and the never Trump ones. You could look at how the center left has evolved. I looked at these folks, and I noted that in addition to sort of the general way, the year to year churn of what issues are important, and therefore what issues the political spectrum tends to be centered around, there have been three sort of crisis moments where, basically something was recognized by the authorities as a social emergency. Um, and a rapid influx of new rules were created, new institutions formed, and as a result, new coalition formed. And one was 9/11, which was obviously a radical break. I think of these, still the most important radical break in the
mhm,
political order. The second was the Great Recession, and the third was COVID. And each of these also happens at about the same time, not the exact same time, but about the same time that there's a change in the presidency. And so all the kind of, are you with the incumbent party or the not incumbent party stuff gets reshuffled too. So 9/11 happens less than a year into the Bush administration. And if you look back at like those first, what is it, 8 months, whatever it is, of the Bush administration now, it feels like a little appendix to the Clinton administration. It does not feel like, I mean, like, the big debates then were like about minor adjustments in environmental regulations. It was just
what
a
a
different
time.
world entirely. Um, the Great Recession broke out at the end of the Bush years, and are and a major part of the reason why Obama was elected president. So
Mhm.
Obama takes power then. Obviously, Biden takes power during the pandemic. And there's also, if you're breaking things up, the one sort of change in parties that does not coincide with one of these crisis points is Trump, which of course
Mhm.
lots of people took as a crisis anyway. So it's, although it's a not exactly the same sort of crisis, but you could call it a ghost crisis or what have you. So you basically have these sort of chunks of time, sort of like 9/11 to the Great Recession to Trump taking power, Trump's election to the COVID outbreak, and then whatever kind of it's not clear sort of what's emerging since then.
Mhm.
And with each of those, there's been a reshuffling of the spectrum and a reshuffling of anti-establishment sentiment and whether people identify more with the left and the right. And so now it feels, I mean, think about how much things like opposing the national security state and being at least rhetorically anti-war has got encoded as right wing, even though the Trump administration is full of pro-war shitheads and so on. I mean, it's still that the coding has changed
Mhm.
in really in ways that would be just completely alien to someone in 2004. Um, it's I mean when like you remember when Ron Paul in 2007 had his moment on the stage in South Carolina. You know, you had bloggers after the next day calling him a rhino because how dare he criticize the Iraq War.
Mhm.
So that's, I mean, that's, and then the article traces this and it looks back at things that have been kind of memory hold, like the time in the Netroots era when people on the, like sort of dissident Democrats who didn't like the Clintonian leadership of the party that supported the Iraq War and in many cases voted for the Patriot Act were very interested in reaching out to libertarians. Were calling themselves libertarian Democrats. There was this whole moment of exchange that was they then kind of disappeared from people's consciousness and memory after when the Tea Party era came along. But it was good to look back at that, look back at some of the different factions of the Occupy movement, which have also been forgotten, and just sort of put this together in some sort of whatever it was 4,500 word narrative. Some of the other articles I've had recently I think, well, one article I did recently actually kind of was originally part of that and I just broke it off because it didn't fit, and obviously it's informed some of the other things I've written. So yeah, so that's what I set out to do, and there wasn't nearly enough room to talk about all the possible angles on it in that feature, but hopefully it can at least be a starting point for people to take a look at what's going on and make sense of it.
This is slightly abrupt, but if I called Donald Trump, or like shorthand for the Donald Trump thing, paleoconservative, would that what would was that off?
I would not call Donald Trump a paleoconservative. I think a lot of paleoconservatives joined the Trump coalition. I think that most of the folks who would call themselves paleoconservatives either support Trump or were Trump supporters and got disillusioned.
Mhm.
Although a lot of them seem really intent on revving up those illusions again as he returns to power, and we pretend that we don't have 4 years of lessons in what this is like. So I'm sorry, I'm going on sidebar, but isn't it wild to watch people watch his foreign policy appointments and get disappointed as though they expected anything else? And now they're just clinging to Tulsi Gabbard as the one part-time quasi dove in the mix to like sort of deny that they were completely snowed and that there's probably a greater risk of certainly a greater risk of war with Iran now than before.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, but I would not call Trump a paleoconservative. I think he's ultimately more of a nationalist than a conservative anyway. I mean, I conservative is a word you can use in different ways. Some of them fit him, some of them don't. But he's been pretty consistently nationalist throughout his career, even when he was a more of a quote unquote moderate Republican or moderate. I guess he wasn't even a Republican then, moderate businessman. Yeah, so I would not call him a paleo in that sense, a paleocon.
Well, the level of sub-labeling, I'm not as advanced at it as you, so
Was that a dig, Lucy?
no, that was
Oh.
no digging myself, I think. Um okay, so like talking to you is usually sort of an exercise in not optimism, I would say, but like where are we going? Are we going like we need those enemies, right? But like the difference between 2016 Trump, I was there. It was ominous. At the RNC, talking about like bragging about how much LGBT people loved him.
Mm.
Um, saying like Caitlyn Jenner can use like whatever bathroom at Trump Tower, like, and now uh that's like that seems substantially backwards. It is a bona fide backlash, and it's mostly to trans people, but I would say gay people are getting some of the splash from that as well, a little bit.
Gay people are getting some of the splash from, online influencer types who are, deep in the weeds of whatever right-wing authoritarian ideology they're sipping from. In terms of general public opinion, this is actually pretty interesting. Um, in a lot of ways, Republican voters got more socially liberal in the Trump era.
Yeah.
This was the article that I split off from the bigger one because it was too big and it didn't quite fit, and I but they I don't want to go into all of the weeds of this, but basically, even though, as we all know, a lot of fringe racist groups got louder and noisier during the Trump years, general public opinion got more socially liberal on questions of race, including among Republicans across that time, and on sexual and continued to, though to a modest amount, in the Biden years, on sexual orientation also got more accepting, and there's been something of a recession of that since Biden became president. But it's still, I mean, the last numbers I saw were still, more accepting of gay people and more accepting of gay marriage as an institution than they were before Trump became president.
Yeah.
So there's a question of, are we just going all the way back now, or was some of it just a matter of they respond? I mean, we're obviously seeing things now where anti-gay ideologues are trying to use the moral panic over trans people as a wedge to sort of get people to turn against gays as well. So you could see this as sort of a sign of, well, 8% of Republicans are willing to go along with that. Will there be more in the future, or is this just sort of a temporary recession while that goes on? I'm inclined to say the latter. I'm
Hmm.
inclined to be more optimistic because ultimately, what there is, like, who had that great line? Like, I don't, someone said it, I don't remember who. The gay rights movement had a secret weapon, which was lots of undercover agents. Once it became okay, or widely accepted to come out, all sorts of people learned that they knew gay people who they
Hmm.
liked, and that is fundamental in a way that a lot of this sort of headline level stuff that, the people who got to get on Twitter and tweet about politics every day are not operating on. So I am a long-term optimist on that. And I think there are also just sort of social reasons why, the there were sort of changes in the nature of heterosexual marriage that kind of made it, in my mind, almost inevitable. Nothing's
Hmm.
inevitable, but almost inevitable that gay marriage would be accepted, because once marriage became perceived not as like I mean, even in the 1960s, you still had relics of the old kind of like like it's a transaction from the parent to the husband, of giving the once we were moved past that legally and culturally, and marriage became seen as kind of a partnership between loving equals whose primary commitment is to each other and to whatever kids they raise. It became much harder to say, well, why can't two guys do that? Why can't two women do that? And in the case of guys, why can't they adopt kids, right?
Hmm.
So that's, I mean, you never want to say that ship has sailed because we've seen things reversed before, but it's not like we're seeing like a big movement to undo the acceptance of interracial marriage right now. You have ideologues who say that, and someone gets highlighted on Twitter because it's horrifying, but there's no mass support for that. There's not even like a big minority push for it. Like everyone, and I think ultimately, at least I hope, gay marriage will be like that.
Hmm.
Trans issues obviously are in a different boat. Although a lot of the stuff that Trump said, since Trump obviously doesn't give a shit either way, he's happy to be pro-trans. He's happy to throw them all in camps, whatever works for him. You know,
That's it.
yeah. I mean, it's really.
The gamut.
But I mean, he said a lot of things when he was competing with DeSantis at a moment when DeSantis still had a serious shot at the Republican nomination, early 2023.
Hmm.
And so the question now is, to what extent does he feel a debt to those folks, and to what extent are they going to be sort of pawned off? I mean, the same way Vivek Ramaswamy's being like, yeah, you get to be assistant manager of our Reborn Grace Commission. Go be annoying someplace else. It's and we'll have to. I mean, I'm not optimistic there, but I also think the dynamics are. I don't know what the dynamics are. I don't know what the dynamics are behind the scenes at the Trump White House. I don't think Trump cares about much of anything at this point besides adulation and revenge. And I don't know how much longer he's going to live anyway. I think that we're going to have sort of an administration on autopilot like we did with Biden in charge, but instead of Biden being just sort of the invisible man, you'll have the guy who periodically tweets something stupid, and everyone will run around, trying to figure out what he means. But it's we're still kind of in this holding pattern until either someone new is elected or he dies and JD Vance takes over. And I'm not sure what JD Vance wants, because he's a bit
Yeah,
of a cipher. He remade himself.
he sure did.
And I hear things from different people about what they think of him. I mean, like, I shouldn't say what they think of him, what they think is important to him. And I'm not going to speculate here about it, because it's just, I don't know how to choose among their speculations. But it's a thing that I feel like the trans issue has kind of, there's like a built-in timer to it. Like, so much of it right now centers around people's concerns about minors,
Hmm.
and you're going to have more and more people who transitioned as minors becoming adults. And either we will see the huge wave of detransitions that people like Abigail Schreier are
Hmm.
predicting, or you're going to see, oh, look, most of them, are happier living their lives like this. And they're or or a mix or whatever. I mean,
Hmm.
I'm not making a prediction here. I'm just telling you the full range of possibilities. And at that point, you're going to have data that's hard for people to ignore. And since I'm inclined to think that, I think that we will have a more tolerant place for trans people in this country 10 years from now, just by virtue of that transition. But what that more tolerant place will look like is hard to say, because we can be guaranteed it's not going to be identical to the rhetoric and demands of the last 10 years, just because, I mean, look at the gay rights movement.
Hmm.
In the 1970s, the just a whole bunch of conventional wisdom changed. We went from everybody's a bit bisexual to some people are born this way. I mean, there's just there's just things evolve as people learn inside a movement, right?
Hmm.
So and I'm not going to predict what people are going to learn over the next 10 years, other than that people will learn things. But I am something of a long-term optimist there too. But there's so many more ways it can go wrong, because so many people are just using trans folks as a designated scapegoat and fear object right now. I mean, deliberately doing so, and
Hmm.
that always opens up a really dangerous possibilities.
My semi back upable thesis, perhaps, is that anytime it's something, the children are doing anything, it's much more threatening to a type of person. But also, like, in the 90s, we had a single drag queen. It was RuPaul. It's the only one. And RuPaul would show up on, like, Sabrina the Teenage Witch, or like other, like, that level of programming for 10-year-olds. And I don't remember, I'm sure somebody was mad. I'm sure Jerry Falwell was mad. Or like Christine Jorgensen in the 50s, the
Yeah.
GI who came back a bombshell. My overly simplistic understanding with her was like, and initially it was like, oh look, a wonder of the atomic age. And then when it
Yeah.
turns out there was more than one, it started to become, oh no, the family and the communists and the threat to.
I remember something a professor told me once in college. This is good. I get to draw on my education. But we were talking, I mean, there was a classroom discussion. He's a sociologist. Um, the upshot was that if there's like one black kid in a class, this was like during desegregation, that would often he would often be or she would often be like the most popular kid in the class, you know.
Okay.
And when it was more like 50-50 or 60-40 or 70-30, there was a lot more tension as people
Hmm.
felt kind of, you know, threatened by something new happening. And I think that there's probably some word for that dynamic.
Yeah, the Germans might have a word for it.
Yeah, well, that's I meant like a scientific word. Um, for that kind of change in how you perceive, like when there's just one, as you were saying. By the
Hmm.
way, I was just recently watching a Bergman movie from the 50s, and there's this scene in it where this girl starts talking about like, oh, I want to be a boy, you know, and it was just very, and it was, and I realized this was like coming like right in the, I think there might have even been like a reference to not Christina Jorgensen by name, but to that whole thing
Hmm.
happening, and I like this was like really odd to sort of see this like and it was just like a passing thing, like just like
Hmm.
they have like a scene, but there was like no like serious like this is going to be a subplot that the you know, the kid wants to change gender identification, but I was like, I'm watching a 70-year-old Bergman movie, and it has like suddenly the trans teen storyline pops up here. So
Well, I mean, the 50s also had the most tolerant movie of the era, of course, Glen or Glenda, which.
a great movie. I unironically think that's a great movie. I'm not being tongue in cheek. I think I think that it is a an avant-garde classic.
Yeah, like, I mean, yeah, it's hard. Like, there's the silliness and it's not a traditionally good movie, maybe we can say, but like, what a fascinating thing that is.
It's
And
outsider art, you know. I mean,
mhm.
if you know, and if you can accept like an outsider art painting as being great art, then I can say whatever the hell it was Ed Wood was doing there, and it also qualifies. So
I mean, there is a part I'm now remembering where I feel like Bela Lugosi is saying something about pull the strings,
yeah, yeah.
and he's like superimposed over some sort of stock footage. I don't know. It's like horse. I have no idea what is. I'm not deep enough to like truly figure out what's going on there, but it's.
He's God, I think, but he's like a demonic God. Honestly, I there was a point at which I was like ready to write a whole book unpacking that movie because it
Do it.
was because oh, this was decades ago, and now of course there's all this extra layer of politics to it. Because there's also the areas where he's kind of conservative, like where he rushes to assure everyone that the transvestite is not necessarily a homosexual.
Right.
You know, but it's fascinating. That whole movie is fascinating, and I had seen it. You know, I feel like there was like a screening in college and other times, and then I every now like few years I would sit down with another friend and say, "You got to see this movie." And I sat down with former Reason staffer, then known as Sarah Ryman Snyder, and I since has married and has a different surname, and we watched it, and there it was like this different cut where they had added a striptease sequence, and it was like so bizarre because they're doing this, and they would cut in these little moments from elsewhere in the movie where Bela Lugosi suddenly turns and looks, and but it's changed. Like now he's like being wowed by the lady taking the clothes off. So yeah, so I also I mean all the different cuts of Glen or Glenda. It's a multitudinous text.
Wow.
We've probably talked about it far more than you expected to when you asked me to be on your podcast.
Well, I was honestly thinking more in my memories that even Ed Wood, who I don't know if you would just call him like a cross dresser in these slightly old parlance, he doesn't fully differentiate between like cross dressing being trans, and then he has a thing about not being not necessarily gay. Like he hasn't even figured it all out yet, but he's still doing the plea for tolerance.
Yeah, it's like and everything sort of tumbling out of his mind onto the screen in a way that defies all normal film grammar,
Yeah.
and it's just fascinating and often hilarious just because of like the ways he cuts quarters. Like
Mhm.
there's like that scene where they keep cutting. I don't know if they just didn't have footage of the people talking, so they just kept cutting to a radiator when this person is speaking. It was so I don't know. It
Oh,
is an avant-garde classic. Everyone should watch it.
I agree. Now I'm just filled with optimism again, so that's good. But yeah, I mean, I think I really think that people are so susceptible. If xenophobia isn't like the easiest thing, cudgel or crowbar to make people do things, then the children actually is.
Yeah, and of course, there's lots of people have the question of how much freedom minors should have is obviously more fraught than the ones about how much freedom adults should have, and so it opens up these discussions to people who might otherwise, who even if they aren't like caught up in the moral panic, might be more willing to give a hearing to certain arguments. But I know, but the xenophobia is interesting because the thing that's actually really like, to worry about on deck is this like attempt to do a mass deportation. And while it's doubtful he'll be able to deport the number of people he's talking about, because that's a huge operation that neither he nor I think anyone he's hired so far has the capacity to organize. You could still do a whole lot of damage trying to do it. And what's interesting though is this happens even as the results of the election should bring, I mean, it's been clear, I think, like developing over a few cycles, but bring to an end the idea that immigrants are a threat to the Republican Party. This is like the argument you keep hearing from people on the right that we need to contain immigration because it's all a big plot to vote Democratic. And now you look at all of the immigrants who voted Republican this time, and all these different ethnic groups that have moved further and further into the GOP column. It's like it's not just a problem with like all the progressives who assumed they own these voters, but all these conservatives who assumed that yeah, the progressives own these voters. No, believe it or not, people are complicated. There are folks coming up from Latin America who do not like legal abortion. There are people who own small businesses who do not like the taxes that Democrats tend to favor, for very good reason, don't like them. There are people living in cities poorly run by Democratic governments who are like willing to take that out on the Democrats,
Hmm.
So it's like there's this moment for, and of course, a lot of these immigrants voting for, I shouldn't say immigrants, people, immigrants and descendants of immigrants,
Hmm.
people of these different ethnic voter backgrounds voting for Trump. Many of them are fine with deportations, or at least they might not like all the groups coming in behind them. Again, it's sort of a reshuffling where one alliance becomes more acceptable as a different enemy comes into view. But I think it's going to be interesting to see how that reshuffles immigration politics. I mean, now, I mean, when I was a kid, it sort of coincided with the movement of a lot of the quote unquote white ethnics out of the New Deal coalition, all these
Hmm.
Irish, Polish, Italian folks starting to vote Republican or stop voting Democratic anyway, but ultimately voting Republican. And nowadays those groups are all just sort of thought of as white, I mean, like the
Hmm.
idea of WASP as a separate category, it just feels completely archaic now, and it'll be interesting to see to what extent that happens with Latin voters and others. This is another part of what makes it so hard to predict what's coming next once we get out of this stasis point. I mean, like the rerun that we're living in right now, and move on to the next thing, like whatever it is Vance or whoever is planning. That how do things get reshuffled? How does this all sort out in the end? Not that there's ever an end. By the way, here's like a frightening thought for you.
Oh, good.
I'm not saying that in 2028 we're going to have Vance versus Polis, but if we do, won't the libertarian culture wars be absolutely
Well,
unbearable?
well, as of the time of recording, also, Jared Polis mysteriously is sucking up to Robert Kennedy in terms of health stuff.
That's not mysterious to me.
No, I didn't know him super well. I had more positive associations. I just want to see the people who agree with Robert Kennedy on health quackery mysteriously not want Polis because he's technically a Democrat and also gay, and those are mysteriously,
No, I think part of the Polis coalition is going to include sort of crunchy. Yeah, it's going to be crunchy Whole Foods types, and he probably thinks there's some areas where he'll agree with Kennedy, and at any rate, it doesn't hurt him to say something nice. And I wasn't really disturbed by that, though I don't like RFK.
hmm
It struck me as just kind of normal, say something nice for someone who's sort of like on the edge of your coalition politics.
Yeah, I think the only surprise was that he had anything to say about it at all, I guess. But if he has
Yeah.
greater ambitions than merely one of the nicer states in the Union, I guess he'll have to. I don't know if I wanted to ask you a little bit about the Libertarian Party specifically.
Oh God.
In terms of mysteriously rejecting people for being allegedly liberal and definitely gay, the Libertarian Party's whole, at least half rejection of their candidate of choice, so occasionally in favor of Robert Kennedy slash Trump slash Robert Kennedy, back and forth. I don't know if you have any thoughts on what they're trying. Actually, you know what? I realize that like times and technology have changed greatly from the '90s. I don't know that they do, but are they doing fusionism again? And is there is it different? Is it going to fail in the same way as it did in the '90s, or in a different new way?
I mean, a lot of these folks are redoing, the Paleo Alliance thing, which
hmm
is not classic fusionism, but like the whole Rothbard Rockwell, we're gonna get together with Pat Buchanan thing. But
hmm
I mean, of course, the difference is those people left the Libertarian Party, like, and sort of frame themselves as seceding from the libertarian movement, and
hmm
the opposite happened here. And now the Mesoids, I think a lot of people who supported them when they did their takeover saw them as being the voice of pure libertarianism, getting away from folks like William Weld being the face of the party. I think they were wrong. It was, to me, it was clear at the time that was not what they were doing at all. But I think there were some folks who were duped by that, and a lot of them have learned better.
hmm
I know what I tweet. I don't really like to get into like all this sort of. I'm not a member of the Libertarian Party. I haven't been since I joined for a year in college because they wanted to put me on the ballot for some local office because they wanted to have a full ticket.
Did you run? Did you
I
win?
yes, I dabbled in well, that's a whole other conversation we could have, but it was not a serious campaign, but I did in fact stand for office.
Wow.
But so I try not to get into like the internal politics of all this. I voted for Chase Oliver because I'm glad they were able to nominate a real libertarian.
hmm
I mean, I would not have voted for Rechtenwald because he's some sort of fascist dipshit who's not a libertarian. But
Literally tweeting about removing Jews.
I try not to do what I just did and like get into things in the level of criticizing people by name because
But
it's
it's
not.
fun though.
I mean, I'll do that in private. It's just like I don't need to get into a flame war with people who are fighting battles that are not my battles because I'm not involved in all this shit. So, but what I did say when the Mises caucus sort of revved up was that they were, you often have conflicts within the Libertarian Party, and this is never the only two groups.
hmm
But you will often have a conflict between two groups where one is the voice of pure libertarianism and the other is the voice of being Republican light. But the Mises Caucus was the first group to be Republican light while posing as the voice of pure libertarianism. That's what I said in 2022 during the takeover. I think that has been completely supported by what's happened since then. And I don't think everyone in the caucus wanted that. And I'm not like denouncing Scott or any of those folks, but I think that's what, the fruits of it was. So I don't. That's probably all I should say.
I mean, that's the weird paradox of the Ron Paul style libertarian, is that, Ron Paul was an elected official who literally voted for the war in Afghanistan. So treating him as the purest libertarian daddy grandpa, I guess, it doesn't even work.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about the revolution of Ron Paul's thinking the last time I was on, and we probably should don't need to redo that. But I will note it was interesting when he ran in 2007, 2008 that he would explicitly say people would ask him about Social Security, and he'd say that's not a priority. He
Hmm.
was, and I was fine with him doing that. I mean,
Yeah.
it made sense to do a campaign where at that point in history where the Iraq War is your number one priority. I mean, he was absolutely that was good. I mean, strategically as well as, and there's no need to, and he would, but it was but people who sort of imagined him as, running as, Harry Brown, and he's going to answer every question with, this is why government doesn't work. That's not what he was doing, for better or for worse. I mean, Ron Paul, I mean, his style is not the style of, the edgelords. I mean, that's not his. He infamously put his name on some newsletters written in an edgelord style, but his style as a,
Proto edgelord.
yeah, as his style as a campaigner, certainly in that election, was towards, building a coalition, not being edgelordy and driving people away. At least when he didn't allow himself to. Well, even then, it wasn't edgelordy. Sometimes he would allow himself to get drawn into conversations that, if he were thinking strategically, he would do the politician thing and change the subject. Like the
Yeah.
first time he went on Bill Maher's show, they somehow got into this whole discussion about the Civil War,
Oh God, I haven't seen that.
and Mar was basically just kind of making fun of him, and it was, and I'm like watching this thing, why is this even like being this, you're a presidential candidate in the 2000s, why are you discussing the 1860s? And then he had his moment with Giuliani on stage, and Bill Maher brought him back on as a hero to talk about the Iraq War, which is what he should have been trying to steer things towards the first time. But when he's on to, and he's a skilled politician, when he didn't fall into traps like that, he took that other path and did it well.
I don't know. I could try to get you to predict things all day long, I suppose, but I wrote down a couple of quotes from your articles because I thought they were delightful.
Thank you.
Okay, so I have to read. It would be fun to go back to 2005 or 6 and talk with some of the Democrats who wanted to work with libertarians to defeat folks like Vice President Dick Cheney. I could tell them that in 2024, a Democratic presidential ticket would work with Cheney to defeat the star or the apprentice. I doubt that story would get me on Al Franken's show, but maybe I could earn a slot on Art Bell. That's
Yeah.
the.
That was in the piece where I talked about going on Al Franken's show because they
Hmm.
were interested in talking with, a libertarian about how to, appeal to redneck voters. And I'm using that term, deliberately because the article that of mine that they saw that got me invited was called "The Hippie and the Redneck Can Be Friends," and it had nothing to do with any of what we're talking about. It was about like Willie Nelson and drive-in movies. It was,
Hmm.
it was just me doing my fun cultural stuff. But I went on to talk about the things they wanted to talk about, and that, ultimately led to me writing that column that you were quoting.
So that book you wrote, United States of Paranoia, which is, I'm sorry, what year is that? 2013 that came out?
Yeah,
Something.
13.
Would that look any different if you wrote it now?
Yeah.
Or might need to update someday. Update maybe or no?
I mean, it's very, um, it. I've said this before. I might have said it when I was on your show before. I've certainly said it on other podcasts that my least favorite chapter of the book is the last one, not the epilogue, but the last, numbered
Hmm.
one, because it started with 9/11, but I was trying to sort of bring in other things that had happened since 9/11. Like I was getting into the Da Vinci Code and some other stuff like that. And just structurally, it was the chapter where I thought, I mean, I made it work, but it was the one where I ran the risk of being like, and then this happened, and I just didn't want to. Everything else in that, every other chapter of that book had like a really specific theme it was built around. That one, it risked getting a little too loose, and the idea of me bringing in everything that's happened in the Trump era to that would have completely destroyed any structural soundness to that piece of writing. And people ask me if I want to write a sequel, and what they really mean is, do you want to write about the Trump era? And I feel like it's better to have. I mean, obviously, I've written about the Trump era, but it's better in terms of writing books to have produced a book that people can then use as a toolkit for understanding the Trump era and all the subsequent eras. And that's what I set out to do, and that is what I hope it works for. If I were to do something I had an idea for something that I won't get into because I don't know if I'm going to try to do it or not. It would sort of be a sequel, or sort of a spiritual sequel, but it would not be everything that's happened since then. It would be a way of tackling the Trump era and the anxieties, both that fueled Trump and that were the anxieties about Trump, all the nonsense people say about quote unquote post truth, and all the authoritarianism on the liberal side of the spectrum, which we haven't talked as much about in this episode, but anyone who listens to non-serviam is probably well aware of the sort of things I'm talking about. But it would, if I were to do that, it would be framed around something completely different like this, and not be my attempt to sort of do volume two, pick
Hmm.
up where it left off. It has to be a freestanding thing. So I'm glad the Trump era is not in there. That book is a book written from whenever it was, 2011 to 2013, whenever I started writing it, and it's a dispatch from that time.
Hmm.
And there might be a few passages I wish I could go back and touch up a little, make myself sound prescient, but I do not regret that there's not an extra chapter about Trump.
But less just the practicalities. Like, I don't know. Do you feel like you were wrong about anything in that book? That, again, you don't make grand predictions because you're not a hack.
Well, I mean, for example, I mean, sure. I mean, like where I discussed the dynamics of the militia movement and the larger patriot milieu. I gave the Oath Keepers as an example of a group that focuses on nonviolent conflict. And obviously, they then moved in a very different direction, starting basically the year after. Actually, the year that book came out is when they started doing the gun. So there are little things like that. Like, because boy, that example doesn't work anymore. I feel like I need to put a little asterisk and say,
So many of us who are at or were at Reason Magazine were accidentally too nice to the Oath Keepers in the early 2010s. You,
but
me.
it was, so there are little things like that where I'm sure I could think of other things. I mean, other things I could think of would mostly be, it would not have to do with Trump era stuff. That would just be historical things where my thinking has changed a little bit, or it's not even it's changed. Like more stuff has emerged. I wish I could have worked in there. Like if I had known this would have extended the argument in this way.
Hmm.
But I don't think I've changed my mind about any sort of big topic in the book. If you wanted to fling a bunch of things and say, but how dare you say this? Maybe then I'd say, oh, I hadn't thought of that. But you're right. But
I mean, I still, my only change mindset in reference to sort of the paranoia topic is not unlike a lot of other people, it gets less and less fun all the time. Like so many things, when it becomes mainstream, it's just not as fun anymore. Paranoia and conspiracy. So I don't know, but I still like. Did it actually like you mentioned in one of your articles that I was reading today about Alex Jones being formerly a fringe figure who was in Richard Linklater movies and stuff,
yeah,
and in the
did he ever reprint you? Did he ever reprint you on Infowars?
yes, actually he did. Yeah, once or twice.
I would do stuff, and it was probably the same with you. If I wrote like a blog post about police brutality, something like that, that sort of issue, and they would never ask permission. They would just put like the
Mhm.
first two paragraphs and then a link to your stuff. But so it's like more of a link than a reprint, but they would have like the big title with your byline as though you were writing for InfoWars,
Yup,
and of course, these days he's probably for police brutality if it's aimed in the right
indeed.
direction. I don't know. I shouldn't say that, but yeah. Alex Jones was a very different figure then. I didn't I mean, he was obviously still a crank, and I didn't like it looking like I was writing for him, because who knows what it would be next to.
Right.
But it was he clearly was much more anti-authoritarian in his politics, or in his rhetoric back then.
Like, which seems insane, but a couple years ago I was like, I what is this feeling? It's actual disappointment in Alex Jones. Because I never expected him to be factual in any way,
Right.
but I expected consistency from cranks that they do not possess, and that they certainly have lost during the Trump era. That's all I'm looking for, is a pure crank that I can depend upon.
This moment of silence is in memory of Alex Jones's integrity.
I mean,
What we will pretend was integrity when we look back with rose-colored glasses.
I love, the other great Paranoia tome, which is literally from the year 2000, I think. John Ronson's Them, and his whole thing where he and Alex Jones infiltrate Bohemian Grove.
Hmm.
And like, there's plenty of mention of like truly nasty people in that book, but darn it, it just seems more fun to be insane back then.
Well, Alex Jones was one of the inspirations for the character Dale Gribble on King of the Hill.
And I love Dale Gribble.
Right. If you're charmed by Dale Gribble,
I am.
then early Alex Jones, at least before he became just a complete grotesque parody of himself, can maybe would strike the same chord on you. No, he had. I saw actually there is an Alex Jones interview with Mike Judge, which I absolutely recommend everybody watch. And there's a moment in there where Mike Judge recalls that he had a video tape. I guess it must have been like an actual VHS tape of three different public access TV conspiracy cranks, which he had labeled Three Dales, and one of them was Alex Jones. And when he tells this story, he's kind of mollifying. He says, "Now you were the more rational one," which made me really wonder who the other two were.
That could have been true. That's the worst part. Okay, why don't we do a bit of a lightning round before I send you on your way?
Okay.
Well, we already kind of hit optimism or pessimism, but I'll do it again. Optimism or pessimism?
Glass half, half and half.
Perfect. Um, to probably steal from the old Reason survey, but worst president of all time?
Wilson.
You people, somebody pick FDR.
No, I'm sorry. Wilson was my least favorite president even before I was a libertarian. I came on this honestly as a teenage lefty reading about World War One, and I came to despise Woodrow Wilson, and also, and this probably is part what drove me towards libertarianism, I came to despise the progressive era. I came to see it as just a great exercise in social control. Again, when I was not yet reading anyone like Rothbard or Carl Hess or David Friedman or whoever. It's just so this I'm sorry, Woodrow Wilson is and let me say something. World War One sort of hits the sweet spot where you've got that 20th century style repression and your old school lynching type repression happening at the same time. I mean, and it just becomes, to my mind, one of the most disturbing periods to read about. I mean, obviously, there are times in particular parts of the country where things are worse. You don't have
Mm,
slavery during World War One, but in terms of like sort of a mania seizing the state and much of the population, it's one of the worst episodes, I think. So Wilson, fuck that guy. At least FDR got rid of prohibition, right? I mean, it wasn't him single-handedly, but he was. Yeah. So
rights or liberation?
in what sense?
Well, this is the problem with the lightning round.
Well, I will say liberation.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, I think technically you might need both, but yes.
I am, since I'm swimming in this Carl Hess related project, and he was very skeptical of rights talk. Though then it was not so much liberation so much as free people coming to agreements. But at any rate, yes, I will say liberation.
Okay, that's good. We anarchism or minarchism.
Anarchy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Because I did tag. I always like forget to ask you about anarchy because you just seem like it seems self evident that you secretly have the heart of an anarchist. Who is your problematic favorite from the conspiracy world?
Oh, um, people can be problematic in different ways.
Sure.
I mean, like, I love reading William Burroughs. He's definitely a conspiracy theorist, and he killed his wife. I mean, that's kind of problematic.
It is many would say that.
Can I give that as an answer, maybe?
I would say so, yeah.
Okay.
Who is your, I guess, your non problematic favorite from who could still be qualified as conspiracy?
I'll say Robert Anton Wilson, who was also a Burroughs fan. So Burroughs and Wilson, that's a good pairing. Yeah.
I would have been very surprised if you didn't say Robert Anton Wilson, who I still haven't read because I am terrible at knowing you, I guess. But
Yeah.
someday.
I will tell you, this is public info, so I can say it. His estate is putting together a collection, an anthology of his uncollected political essays, or a lot of them, and also including some interviews and so on. And I have written an introduction to it, which covers a wide scope of what you might say the intellectual history of, I don't want to say of the fringe, because I don't mean it in a bad way, but of this sort of zone beyond left and right and the ways it can manifest itself in different ways. And he is a great lens for that because his politics evolved a lot, but with a certain core to it. And he's like Carl Hess in that way too. So I like these figures where you can sort of use them as kind of like a traveling lens on history, especially if their underlying politics are appealing. So
Mhm.
I'm turning your lightning round into a get stuck in the mud while I have a second thought round. So yeah,
Well, it's comparatively quicker.
yeah.
How about what is the best concert you ever attended?
I saw Sun Ra play at the Frog Island Festival in Ypsilanti, Michigan in, I think, 1990, might have been 91, and that has not been matched,
Okay.
especially when the orchestra moved from this sort of wild, sort of archeo-futurist mixture of stuff that sounded like it was centuries old with avant-garde stuff to a rousing performance of "Let's Go Fly a Kite," which was just one of the most joyful things I'd ever heard anyone play. So I you probably thought I'd say some country musician or something,
No,
but
I mean I don't know. Yeah. However, I feel like I should now have a country this or that because you were mentioning Merle Haggard in the one thing I read of yours today.
well, I saw him play twice. They were both good shows. My favorite, I've told this story on another podcast. I won't make it long, but my favorite country music concert memory is probably when I went to see Willie Nelson do a free show at a Borders.
Wow.
He was going to be playing with Ray Charles. This was like the weekend before I moved away from Los Angeles to come out here to Baltimore. And I saw that he and Ray Charles were doing a big show together, and it cost like 80 something dollars for tickets, and
Hmm.
I couldn't afford it. Remember, this was like 2001 money, but he was going to do a free show at this Borders in Westwood, and I had seen John Doe play there once, and he just sort of got up with his guitar and played for 15 minutes. There's a few people in the audience, and I thought it would be like that. I mean, probably more than just a few people because Willie Nelson is more famous. So I get up there, and the place is packed. I mean,
Hmm.
it's not like five of us sitting there, and Willie's up there with his full band, and they played for an hour and they gave it their all. It was like getting to see. I mean, I've paid like $20 admission to see people play for 45 minutes, and I paid nothing to see Willie Nelson and his band go through Whiskey River and all the other songs you want to hear. So that was a happy memory too. But Sun Ra still Although I listened to way more Willie Nelson records than Sun Ra records, the Sun Ra concert was the best one.
Well, I almost said Willie Nelson or Merle Haggard.
Oh well, as who do I like better as
Hmm.
Merle Haggard?
Really?
Yeah.
Is Mama Tried, as I profess, the perfect, the platonic ideal of the country song? Because that is my argument.
It's a great song, and I would not change it at all. But I think the um, the platonic ideal and maybe his best composition is "Sing Me Back Home."
Okay, I should probably listen to more Merle. I am wearing my Hank Williams shirt now for this
Oh,
occasion.
okay.
Okay, so where is your first stop in history when you have a time machine?
Oh, can I go talk with my younger self and tell him to add certain things that would make me look prescient into that
Mm,
book?
I don't know. That's no. It's one of those things where you have to go back before you were born.
Well, that's a my one of my kids told her teacher some years ago that her dad was a historian, and she said, "Oh, what's his favorite period?" And so she came home and asked me, and I realized the answer was the 1970s. Of course, I was born in 1970.
Oh, well, all right. Well,
Maybe I'm just fascinated by these 10-year periods because your first 10 years feel like 100 years, and trying to figure out what was actually going on. There's probably some sort of psychoanalytic take. Yeah,
we'll let you go in grade school because I don't know
yeah.
if you were getting around much when you were 7. So if you want to go
Yeah.
back,
I'd actually have to pick the time in the 60s or 70s where I could hear a concert that would be even better than that Sun Ra one. So you can ask me that again next time. I'll think about it.
okay. Even now, though I don't listen to them as much, I feel like my first stop would probably be The Clash. I don't know when exactly and where, but like, if you're not going to concerts with your time machine, what are you even doing with it?
Yeah. I could see the Kinks play when they were still the Ravens. Yeah.
I don't know that I knew that was the thing. Okay.
Yeah.
That is a band I associate with you as well, and my mom, so because she has good taste. I also do you have a single story you were most proud of writing?
Oh, like an article.
Yeah, brag about your work.
I don't know if I have a single story I'm most proud of writing. I certainly had fun writing that story about Arden, Delaware. I don't know if that's my favorite. It's one of my favorites. This is a suburb of Wilmington that was founded by Henry Georgists,
Nice.
and they ultimately incorporated kind of to protect themselves from because they were gonna the state wanted to put a highway where people didn't want it, but they for a long time they were sort of they basically formed. They didn't use the phrase community land trust back then, but that's sort of how it was set up, and they sort of enacted the program privately. So there's this kind of anarchistic element to what they were doing. Though, of course, people would at different times call on the state to help them in one conflict or another, which is also interesting to look at. So that was a lot of fun to work on. I'm having a great time working on this piece I'm working on now, speaking to various folks, but I don't know yet whether I'll be proud of the results. Um, so I don't know, maybe the Arden piece. I don't know if it's my favorite in terms of the best I've written, but it's a good one I've written, and it was definitely a lot of fun to write.
I almost asked you Hayek or Mises.
Hayek.
Okay.
That's kind of by default because I've read a lot more Hayek than I have Mises, but I think I have a more Hayekian sensibility. You asked me earlier about ways my thinking has changed, and I've
Hmm.
moved. I was much more towards the start with some foundations and deduce a lot from them way of looking at the world when I was in my late teens, early 20s. And even though I have the soul of an empiricist, and I guess that eventually won out. So
Um, I ask you again in case you have a different way of acquiring a cappuccino?
I think I would get it from that. I would get in my utopia of tomorrow. I would get all coffee products from that huge Superman mug that you've been drinking from throughout this
Thank you.
entire conversation, which you should, I don't know, put it in the show notes or something. I feel like you're getting like Krypton energy every for the next question every time you raise that to your lips. So
Yeah, Superman is saying it tickles and he's being hit by lightning or something. So it's a good mug. It's
yeah.
very good. If you can do it off the cuff, I never warn people, but do you have specific media recommendation people, three of them for people to check out to get like the sense of you without being, you directly?
Well, movie, I'll say Repo Man. Book, maybe The Third Policeman, maybe A Scanner Darkly. Those are novels I like a lot.
Okay.
Music, well, we talked about the Kinks earlier. Muswell Hillbillies is my favorite album.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, that's a very good, well-rounded three. And also, we totally forgot to talk about social media, and I actually feel a beautiful sense of calm having not thought about the word Elon or Musk or Twitter, even though we did talk about politics. So perhaps maybe at some point we can reevaluate that because it was such a big to do last time. And we were like, gosh, will Elon Musk make Twitter any worse? Who can say? We were very innocent back then, very young.
I got to say, the things that he made worse about it were not anything that the thing that I think got worse about Twitter are not any of the things people were predicting. Like things like turning the blue check system so it means nothing,
Hmm.
or actually, I mean, I don't really care about that so much, except in as much as I don't really know if somebody is who they claim to be anymore, or the throttling things that link out is a horrible change. I mean, that's the worst one he made, and it's related to destroying the trending list because now you click on a topic and be a bunch of quote unquote open source intelligence accounts just blabbing, and you don't know what their sources are because everyone's afraid to put links in there. So like, I don't care that a bunch of right wing people came back, whatever. But I think that the things he did that were kind of trying to make it more of a walled garden have been really bad for it.
I'll say some of those decisions make me feel like I could be a branding genius, though I have nothing to do with anything. Like, as far as my understanding of brands is, you don't purposefully make your brand more generic when it
Yeah,
already has a. You don't change retweet to repost.
right.
Like that's.
You don't make yourself literally brand X.
Yes, exactly. I forgot about brand X. That's true.
That isn't a case. That's like a dumb move, but it doesn't change the user experience. Whereas the throttling of links does.
Yeah.
And that was like the big. It's weird though because there's been this big. I'm now getting a little more active on Blue Sky, mostly just cross posting, but I'm interacting with people there too. And there's some stuff I post that's only there, not in Twitter, and vice versa. But it's interesting that the real flood of people there, where I'm suddenly getting all these followers, is just post election. It just has to do, I think, with people not wanting to support Elon Musk because he's cozy with Trump, which
Hmm.
I'm like, I've spent my whole life reading media owned by people who are cozy with horrible, horrible leaders. I don't think that that's something unusually bad about Elon Musk. I mean, it's like, since the days of Henry Luce or whatever. But it's interesting that that's been what's kind of flooded, unleashed the, I don't want to say the unleashed the flood because there's still a lot of people on Twitter, and the thing, even with the throttling, I get more response to things I post there than on Blue Sky.
I don't anymore, but
But the fact that people are sort of pushed by the partisanship is, how do you like Blue Sky? You moved there. You're much more there than on Twitter now, right?
yeah, my entire life is spent overly thinking about like what my principals are telling me I should do. But that just means I like go to a store and carefully avoid all Nestle products and then buy some Coke Zero. Like I'm not, but I feel like if I give up on all things, then I'll just not care at all.
Hmm.
And the Elon Musk thing just seemed so he's such a personality and a tedious one. Like I just miss the old like backroom deal funding. Like dark money and stuff. Like I want it to be nice and veiled. I don't want like some would be celebrity being in charge of my terrible media thing. So I don't know. But
Yeah.
Bluesky is,
He's Ted Turner. I feel like he is like what Ted Turner was in the 80s.
but he also blessed us with Turner Classic Movies. So, you know.
No, I'm not even knocking. I meant in terms of like sort of like the persona of like the swashbuckling independent. I don't know that Turner was a billionaire, however much money he had. It was a lot back then. And also being sort of an outsider within the establishment, but not really being a radical alternative, you know? So he's
Yeah.
sort of an independent center of power in the same way Turner was when he had CNN and all that. So, yeah, I mean, no, obviously Elon Musk is not giving us Turner Classic Movies, which was my favorite channel back when I watched channels. So,
Yeah, that was a good one.
yeah,
But yeah, Bluesky needs more people like you because it is pretty Democrat-y, unlike not full on hashtag the resistance K Hive whatever Democrat, but a little more left than that. But it's still, you know, but like I don't know. I just needed the I don't know. It's working pretty well, I think.
it's not, you know, the phrase people have been using is echo chamber. And I found as soon as I joined Blue Sky, people are very, very defensive about that term.
All they're doing today is posting about how it's not an echo chamber.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's better because a week ago it was people posting about how it was good that it was an echo chamber. I actually don't think my initial reaction when I signed on, it was, and I might have said this, and I was on another show like a week ago, it hasn't posted yet. I don't remember if I used the phrase echo chamber, but I said like that there was kind of like a more conformity there just because it was a smaller. And I think as more and more people have joined, that's less true now. And I'm starting to see the kind of you know, it's not all the group think that I was. But I tell you, there's nothing quite so meta as seeing a whole bunch of people reacting to the phrase echo chamber in the exact same way.
That is literally what's happening today. It is true. But I think people also forget the days of sort of sarcastically posting on Twitter how you should never post. Like there was a lot of slightly ironic Twitter hating even before the Musk days. So like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's not.
Long before the Musk days, you
Hmm.
know. I mean, Twitter went downhill long before Musk came along.
Perhaps
It
it
was
was always downhill. I don't
no,
know.
I mean, it was I really enjoyed it the first few years I was on there. But it was just I mean, a lot of it had to do with the culture of, you know, I mean, the people who were there. I mean, it was someone had this line once, Twitter is where you find you like people you like strangers, and Facebook is where you find that you hate people you know.
Yes, that feels right.
I miss the days when that was the case. You know, I go on Twitter and have this great conversation with someone who I completely disagree with. And then I go on Facebook and I find out that someone I went to high school with has some horrifying opinion about what to do with migrants or whatever. But
Yeah.
I mean, and what changed that was really just sort of the cultural shift with Trump more than any kind of systemic.
I I
Yeah.
think that was my great shift because I never got over the point when like everyone was yelling. When I
Mhm.
was the only one yelling, it felt novel, or I was in the minority. Now everyone's yelling, so I don't know what to yell.
Yeah.
Or like back when the now defunct Bitch magazine was novel because it overly thought about pop culture in like a political way, and then
Right.
remember when that would have been slightly novel compared to like all of media, it seems like, and now it seems like the most redundant thing.
Well, not just the most redundant thing, but because it's a thing to do, there's a lot more people who are bad at it doing it.
Yeah.
I mean, bitch was never on the level of like Screen Rant. It's just terrible analysis, right? You know, I mean, that's just, it's like that's where you go if you want to be a cultural critic and can't. But I know what you mean, though.
Yeah.
I will tell you one thing I do not like about Blue Sky is a number of people who used to be on Twitter and I have not missed, and now I see where they went.
Oh, there you are. Yeah.
You know, like some like I see, oh God, I see that ex Gawker person is still doing the same fucking shtick as 8 years ago. You
I'm
know,
sure they were. I
yeah,
wish I
but you know,
or 10 of them, I don't know.
yeah,
I do kind of like I feel like the scolding about using alt text is kind of interesting, because it would be interesting if that became an internet posting norm more so. Because I know people who use screen readers.
There are people who will go after folks in on Twitter for that too.
Bluesky, it's become like it's the thing to do though. I feel like if you
Yeah.
don't do it, suddenly it's
I don't know. I just today I started. I'd been wondering, should I start cross posting the morning images? For those who are listening, I do every morning. I do something called your morning image on Twitter,
I do love the more images.
and I wasn't sure about it because often it's I will quote tweet something on Twitter, and it's like, how do I do that on Blue Sky? And I think I've got an idea in my mind of how to do it. We'll see, but at any rate, though, part of the point of the morning image is just to sit it there and not explain it and let people draw what they want from it. And I feel like, having an alt text that lays it out is kind of just, I don't know, maybe there's a way to do it without over explaining things. But anyway, this morning, for the first time, in honor of, because we're recording this on the anniversary of the Kennedy assassination, and I had a
Oops.
assassination themed image, and I went and I figured I should do this on both. And then right after I posted, I had a milestone. I lost a Blue Sky subscribe follower, and immediately, like, it goes down one. I thought, all right, people here are not interested in assassination humor, maybe. But
I am.
yeah, of course you are. Well, you're not the one who left.
No,
So
that's true.
yeah.
Blue Sky is also full of extremely upsetting Palestinian accounts with GoFundMe's. So, okay, Jesse Walker, where can the people find you on the internet?
Well, I am at Reason Magazine.
You
I
certainly are.
post on both Twitter and Blue Sky. My Twitter account is not Jesse Walker, and my Blue Sky account is something like that. Do not try to follow me on Facebook unless you know me, because that's just like photos of my kids and stuff. Yeah, so Twitter, Blue Sky, Reason, and sometimes I freelance for other places. But if you follow me, oh, and I've got like a mostly inactive blog from the olden days, but we're about to have the moment where I rev it up again to talk about the films of yesteryear. So if you want me totally non-political mode, you can go over to the perpetual three dot column, as my old blogspot site is called.
To be fair, to you do bring the controversy by occasionally including seasons of TV shows as the best movie of the year, which
What else are you going to do for the last, like, for the aughts and teens? Sometimes you have to do that, right? I once had a Soviet TV commercial as one of the top 10. So
okay, I missed that. Wow. Okay.
I'll have to send it to you, and you will see immediately, like, because as with Glenn or Glenda, it's like a, what the fuck am I watching? I
Wow.
don't know what the intent behind this is, but it is remarkable. So,
All right. Well, that's a reason to go back to the blog days. Right. I feel like that was good. I feel more at ease about the world now.
and I feel more worried.
Perfect. You're listening to the Non-Serviam podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, why not subscribe over on our YouTube channel or on your favorite podcast platform. You can also follow us across social media on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Mastodon. If you're extra interested in seeing this project continue, consider becoming a patron over at patreon.com. But if you can't contribute financially, we still like you a whole lot, and you can help us out just by liking and sharing this episode or any other one that catches your fancy. As always, shout out to our existing patrons. Your support helps us reach a larger audience and helps keep this project alive. Thanks so much.